Christmases at my grandmother's house always carried an air of untouched tradition. Yellow lights, flickering like lost stars, hung from the porch. The scent of pine and freshly baked cookies filled the air. But there was something else about that house. Something that, over the years, I began to notice as a shadow hanging over the celebrations. I must have been 7 or 8 years old when I first heard the rule. It was Christmas Eve, and the living room was warmed by the crackling fire in the hearth. My grandmother sat in her green velvet armchair, her voice hoarse and deliberate, holding a cup of tea in her hands. She was small and frail, but when she spoke, there was something in her tone that made everyone stop and listen. "Never look outside if you hear the bells." The adults around the table fell silent. Even my father, always so skeptical and playful, looked down at the rug as if her words were etched in stone. Curious, I asked, "Why?" My grandmother stared at me for a moment, her blue eyes seeming brighter, almost gray, in the firelight. She slowly shook her head. "There are things that live between us and the other side, boy. Things no one can explain." She paused, took a sip of tea, and continued. "They only appear on Christmas Eve, when the barriers are weaker. You'll always hear bells before they arrive. It's a warning. You can hear them, but you must never, ever look." I laughed, expecting her to say it was a joke, but the laugh caught in my throat when I realized no one else found it funny. The tension in the room was palpable, as if even breathing was dangerous. That night, lying in the guest room bed, I stayed awake for hours. The bedroom window faced the backyard, where the wind swayed the dark trees. The curtain moved softly, and I could almost hear my grandmother's words echoing. "They only appear on Christmas Eve." The bells. I didn't know what to expect, but in that moment, I wanted to hear them. Part of me thought it was a story to scare children, something to ensure we didn't wander out of the house at night. Another part believed. The next morning, I asked my mother about the rule. She seemed uncomfortable and tried to change the subject. When I pressed her, she only said, "It's a family tradition. Just follow it, sweetheart." Years went by, but the rule never changed. I always overheard the adults whispering about it, but no one ever gave details. It was like an unspoken pact. They were mentioned as something inevitable, yet distant, like a storm you knew to avoid at all costs. As a child, I obeyed blindly, but as I grew older, curiosity began to eat away at me. What could be out there? Now, in my 20s, returning to my grandmother's house for another Christmas, the rule seemed even more absurd. I wasn't a child anymore, and scare stories didn't convince me. But at the same time, the unease of the older family members, that cautious silence whenever the topic was brought up, was hard to ignore. That night, as snow fell gently outside and everyone gathered around the table, I noticed how the atmosphere felt different. The fireplace was lit, laughter filled the space, but there was an underlying tension, a weight that only I seemed to feel. Then, close to midnight, my grandmother, now with a voice weaker than ever but with the same resolute gaze, said, "Remember, no matter what happens, do not look outside if you hear the bells." And, for the first time, I thought about disobeying. Christmas dinner ended with the same solemnity as always. While the adults discussed trivialities and the children played by the tree, something nagged at me. The rule, that warning repeated year after year, always with the same grave and mysterious tone, felt stronger that night. I can't explain it, but the tension was almost tangible. It was my Uncle Davi, always a bit careless and nonchalant, who let slip the first thread I began to pull. He was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, balancing a glass of wine in his hand, when he casually remarked, "That story about the bells. Not everyone used to take it so seriously, you know?" I immediately turned my head, surprised that someone would speak about it so lightly. My father, sitting across the room, suddenly raised his head, as if pulled by an invisible string. "Davi," he said, in a warning tone, "don't start. but Davi just shrugged and took another sip of wine. What? He's an adult now. He's too old to be scared of this nonsense. Nonsense? That word echoed in my mind. My uncle was clearly more relaxed than usual, and the wine seemed to have loosened his tongue. What are you talking about? I asked, leaning toward him. Davi looked at me with a faint smirk but didn't answer. My father stepped in before he could continue. This isn't a conversation for tonight. The way he spoke, quick and sharp, made Davi's smirk vanish. An uncomfortable silence hung in the room, but by then, something inside me was already resolved. If no one wanted to talk, I would find my answers on my own. My grandmother's house had always been a labyrinth of secrets. Every room seemed to hold memories I wasn't allowed to uncover. But the attic always had a different aura. I waited until everyone was occupied with games and conversations to climb the narrow stairs and push open the creaky door to the upper floor. The attic was small and stuffy, with a slanted ceiling and a single frosted window. The light from a hanging bulb cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls lined with boxes and furniture draped in sheets. I searched without knowing exactly what I was looking for, but a box labeled "Photos" caught my eye. It was old, with frayed edges, and the cardboard seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. I carefully opened it, lifting a layer of bubble wrap to reveal a pile of old albums and yellowed envelopes. I flipped through the first album, and the images were what you'd expect. Past Christmases, family members smiling by the tree, children unwrapping presents. But at the bottom of the box, I found something different. It was a loose photograph folded at one corner. Unfolding it, I saw an image of a group gathered in the backyard of the house. Probably from the 1950s or 60s, judging by the clothing styles. What caught my attention was the expression on their faces. There were no smiles, just serious, distant looks, as if something outside the frame terrified them. But the most disturbing part was the faces. Some of them were scratched out with black pen, the marks so forceful that the paper was torn in places. On the back of the photo, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Don't look outside." My heart raced. It was the same rule, the same warning. I picked up another envelope at the bottom of the box and found more photographs. In some, there were people I didn't recognize, but one, in particular, caught my attention. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair. She seemed familiar, but I couldn't place her. At the bottom edge of the photo, written in pencil, was the name Beatriz. Beatriz. My mother had never spoken much about her family, but now I remembered one detail. Beatriz was the name of a sister she said had died young. They never mentioned how or why, and now, holding that photo, I realized something that had gone unnoticed all these years. Beatriz was looking at something outside the frame of the photo. Her expression wasn't fear, but fascination. As if something had caught her attention, something she couldn't resist staring at. I put everything back in the box but took Beatriz's photo with me. I went down the stairs, feeling a mix of unease and urgency. That night, before bed, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. The scratched out faces, Beatriz's gaze, the words on the back of the photo. For the first time, I began to question whether the rule was truly a precaution against something imaginary or if there was something real and dangerous out there, something no one wanted to face. And for the first time, the idea of disobeying didn't just seem tempting, it felt inevitable. On that Christmas Eve, the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't just the typical peaceful quiet of a winter night, but something denser, as if the air itself was waiting for something. The warmth of the fireplace wasn't enough to dispel the cold that seemed to emanate from somewhere I couldn't identify. My mother spent much of the evening near me, almost as if she wanted to keep an eye on me. I tried to act normally, but my mind was elsewhere, focused on the photos I'd found in the attic, and that phrase burned into my memory. "Don't look outside." Then, just before midnight, it happened. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a sound so faint that I barely registered it. But soon, it grew clearer. A metallic tinkling, slow and rhythmic. The bells. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, as if the wind carried it from some distant place. I closed my eyes and tried to concentrate. It wasn't like the cheery bells of reindeer in Christmas movies, bright and melodic. The sound was wrong. It was uneven, with a dry tone, like old rusty bells. Around me, the atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations stopped, laughter vanished, and everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath. My mother, sitting next to me, gripped my arm tightly. "Don't look outside, sweetheart. Remember, I wanted to ask if she heard it too, but her expression told me she did. She knew. They all knew. The sound of the bells grew louder, but the rhythm stayed the same. My curiosity swelled, an almost primal urge to stand up, go to the window and look. It was as if the sound was calling me, teasing me. I started to rise, but my mother, with a quick movement, pulled my arm. No, her voice was low but firm. There was fear in her eyes. We stayed that way for several minutes as the sound ebbed and flowed, sometimes so loud it seemed to be at our door, other times fading into the distance, almost vanishing. Finally, the bells stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. Even under the covers, I could feel the cold air from the window next to the bed. Every small noise, the creaking of the house, the crackling of the heater, even the distant sound of the wind, made my heart race. It was around 3 in the morning when I heard the footsteps. They started slow, as if something were walking through the yard, crunching the snow beneath heavy feet or paws. I stayed still, trying to convince myself it was some animal, maybe a stray dog. But then I heard the sound of something scraping along the side of the house, a long, deliberate scratch. My heart pounded, and then came the whisper, "Lucas!" I froze. The voice was soft, almost imperceptible, but I knew what I'd heard. My name. I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize. It was impossible. Maybe it was the wind, or some trick of my mind. But then it came again. "Lucas, come." It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, almost melodic, but wrong somehow. Like something trying to mimic a human voice, but not quite getting it right. The urge to look out the window became almost unbearable. Fear and curiosity swirled together, creating a storm in my mind. Then I heard something else. The sound of the back door, downstairs, creaking open slowly. Someone or something had entered the house. I got up slowly, my feet touching the cold floor. My mother was in the next room, and for a moment I considered calling her. But something stopped me, a mix of shame and the certainty that if I said anything, she would stop me from discovering the truth. The steps inside the house were slow, deliberate, as if the intruder knew everyone was asleep. I moved toward the door of my room and cracked it open slightly. The hallway was cloaked in darkness, except for the faint light spilling from a forgotten kitchen lamp. And then I saw it. A shadow passed at the far end of the hall, tall and thin, moving strangely, as if its joints didn't work properly. I couldn't make out details, but I knew immediately it wasn't human. My entire body froze. Before I could decide what to do, the bells started again, this time inside the house. The early morning hours felt endless. After the bells stopped and the shadow disappeared down the hall, I sat on the bedroom floor, hugging my knees to my chest, trying to convince myself it had all been a nightmare. But the silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the sounds. When the sun finally began to brighten the windows, I decided I needed answers. My grandmother, always so serious about the rule, had to know more than she let on. Something inside me told me she hadn't told us everything. I waited until the house began to stir, the sound of morning footsteps and the clinking of cups indicating it was safe to leave my room. As I descended the stairs, I found my grandmother alone in the living room, sitting in her armchair, looking more frail than ever. The distant look on her face gave me the courage I needed to act. After exchanging a few words, I waited for her to go to her room and seized the opportunity. I climbed back up to the attic, The photo I'd found the night before wouldn't leave my mind, and I was convinced there had to be more up there. In a smaller box, hidden beneath an old trunk, I found the diary. The leather cover was faded and cracked with age, and the yellowed pages gave off a musty smell mixed with old ink. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling, as the dim attic light illuminated my grandmother's delicate, precise handwriting. The first page was already a warning. If you found this, then you already know enough not to ignore it. This story is not for the curious, but for those who wish to survive. I turned the page, my heart racing, and began to read. My grandmother started by describing her childhood in the same house, decades earlier. Even then, the rule existed, passed down from generation to generation. But unlike me, she seemed to have lived through much darker events. She mentioned an older brother, Jamie, someone I had never heard about before. Jamie was always too curious. That night, he was the only one who looked out the window when the bells rang. We told him not to, but he laughed, saying it was just a made-up story by adults to scare us. The next paragraph described what happened afterward. We didn't see anything at first. He stayed silent, as if all he saw was the snow. But that very night, he began to act strangely. Jamie, always so talkative and confident, spent the next day quiet, staring at the walls, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. When I asked him what he'd seen, he only said, "They have a smile you can feel, even if you can't see it." My grandmother continued recounting Jamie's behavior in the following days. He seemed distant, lost, until a week later he simply disappeared. The family searched for him for days, but no trace was ever found. Not even footprints in the snow. But the diary didn't stop there. In the following pages, she described her own encounters with them. It was clear that my grandmother had never broken the rule, but that didn't mean she was safe. On several Christmas nights, she felt their presence. You don't have to look at them to know they're there. When the bells ring, it's as if the air changes. Everything feels heavier, as though time itself slows down. And sometimes, even with the curtains closed, you can feel their smile. It's not a smile you see. It's something that pierces into your mind, something you feel deep inside, like a secret that should never be revealed. I turned a few more pages and found something even more disturbing. If you look, they take more than your life. They take pieces of you, memories, feelings, and what's left isn't human. I saw it in Jamie before he disappeared. I saw it in others who broke the rule. It's not just death you risk by looking. It's losing what makes you, you. The last page of the diary was a warning written in capital letters, underlined several times. They cannot enter without being invited, but they will do everything they can to be let in. Voices, whispers, footsteps. No matter what you hear, do not answer. Do not let them in. And above all, never look. I closed the diary with trembling hands. The image of Jamie, lost and hollow, now mingled with the voice that had called my name the night before. Had I come as close to breaking the rule as he had? I came down from the attic, clutching the diary to my chest. There were questions I needed to ask, but more than that, I had the sense that it was already too late to turn back. The bells had rung. They knew I was there. The following days were a blur of anxiety. Each night felt longer and heavier, as though something invisible and inevitable was creeping closer. The bells rang again every night, always at the same time, always with the same rhythm, but growing louder, as if they were drawing nearer to the house. I pretended not to hear them, but my body reacted on its own. My throat dried, my breathing became shallow, and cold sweat covered me even under the blankets. And the shadows, they began appearing soon after I read the diary. At first, they were fleeting movements in my peripheral vision, like the trick of light when a car passes by. But there were no cars on that rural road, no streetlights to cast reflections. On the second night, I went to the hallway window to check. With the curtains drawn, I stood still, listening only to my own breathing. The wind blew outside, and the glass trembled slightly, but there was no sound beyond that, until I saw it. A dark figure, tall and still, stood in the yard. The silhouette was indistinct, but it was there. It didn't move, but it seemed larger than any person could be. Panic crept up my spine. Without thinking, I stepped back, stumbling into the hallway table and almost knocking over the lamp. When I turned back, the shadow was gone. At breakfast, my mother seemed more tense than usual. Her eyes were sunken, as if she hadn't slept, and her hands trembled as she held her coffee cup. My father, sitting beside her, didn't look any better. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice betrayed my unease. My mother just shook her head, staring at her plate as if the food were an unsolvable puzzle. My father was the one who answered, but he didn't look at me. "Nothing. Just follow the rules." "This isn't nothing," I snapped. "The shadows, the bells. I know you know what's happening." My mother finally looked up at me, and there was something different in her expression. It wasn't anger or fear. It was resignation. She placed her coffee cup on the table with exaggerated care and said, "You wouldn't understand until you see." The oppressive silence that followed hung in the air. For a moment, I thought she would say more, but all she added was, "And if you see, it'll be too late." Her response echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. I tried to make sense of her words, but all it did was deepen my frustration. I began to doubt everything. Was my family losing control, or was I the one going mad? The tension, the constant fear, seemed to choke every moment of my life since returning to my grandmother's house. That night, as everyone went to bed early, I found myself wandering through the house, trying to find answers anywhere. It felt as though the walls, the furniture, even the air, held secrets I couldn't reach. And then the bells rang again. But this time there was something different. The sound didn't just come from outside. It echoed within the house, a metallic chime that seemed to reverberate through the walls. My heart raced, and my breathing quickened. I approached the living room window, hesitating for a moment. That's when I saw the shadow again. Not in the yard this time, but on the porch, massive and still. My mother's words echoed in my mind. "If you see, it'll be too late." I was caught between fear and curiosity, and for a moment, the urge to look closer almost overwhelmed me. But before I could do anything, I heard footsteps behind me. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" It was my mother's sharp voice. She pulled me away from the window, yanking the curtains closed with a rough tug. Her face was pale, her wide eyes glimmering with desperation. "Don't do it. Never do it. I just want to understand," I shouted back. She stared at me for a long moment, her hands trembling as they gripped the shoulders of my pajama top. Finally, she sighed, exhausted. "You don't want to understand, Lucas." Her voice was now low, almost a whisper. "Trust me, you don't." Before I could insist, she pushed me toward my room. "Go to bed. Don't come out. Don't ask anything else." As I climbed the stairs, still in shock, an idea began to form in my mind. If my family wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. That very night, I would make a decision that would change everything. I would find out what was out there, even if it meant breaking the rule. The house was adorned with twinkling lights, wreaths, and the aroma of Christmas food filled the air. But the atmosphere was anything but festive. The decorations felt like a desperate attempt to maintain a normalcy that fear had long since eroded. The table was set with porcelain dishes and silverware that only came out this time of year. The feast was plentiful, as always, but the conversations around the table were muted, the smiles forced. My parents exchanged nervous glances, as if waiting for something to happen. Even my Uncle Davi, usually carefree, seemed restless, tapping his fingers on his wine glass. My grandmother, however, remained calm, slicing pieces of turkey with the precision of someone who had done it dozens of times before. though her distant gaze suggested she was somewhere else entirely. I tried to act natural, but everything felt wrong. Even the clock on the wall seemed to conspire against us. Each second felt longer than the last, the ticking echoing like a reminder of what was to come. As the hours passed, I wondered how no one else seemed to notice the almost physical pressure in the air, as if something invisible was squeezing the lungs of everyone in the room. After dinner, my mother insisted that everyone go to bed early. I knew she was trying to avoid the inevitable approach of midnight, but I had already decided that this time I would stay awake. Back in my room, I made sure to keep the door closed but didn't lock it. I needed the freedom to act when the opportunity arose. I took out my grandmother's diary, now hidden under the mattress, and flipped through the pages one last time. Her words felt like a final warning. They always try to make you look. That's how it starts. I lay on the bed with the light off, but my eyes were wide open. Outside, the wind whispered through the window cracks, and the house creaked more than usual. Every sound put me on edge, as if the very environment were conspiring to unsettle me. And then it happened. The bells started ringing again, faint at first, then growing louder. This time there was no doubt the sound wasn't just outside. It filled the space, resonating through the walls as if it were inside the house. I got out of bed carefully, my feet touching the cold floor. I stood still for a moment, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere. Then, another sound. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving down the hallway. I went to the door and cracked it open, just enough to peek out. The hallway was dark, except for a faint light coming from downstairs, likely from the Christmas tree. The footsteps continued, but I couldn't see anyone. My heart was pounding so hard I feared it might be heard. I was sure there was something or someone there. I shut the door and went to the bedroom window. I looked at the closed curtains and hesitated. The urge to open them was strong, almost irresistible. It was as if the bells were calling to me, whispering through the walls. I tried to push the thoughts away, but then I heard something else. Lucas! My name. The voice came from outside, soft, almost gentle, but something about it was wrong. It was familiar yet distorted, as if something were trying to sound human but failing. My entire body tensed, fear and curiosity battling within me. My hands were inches from the curtains, but then the sound changed. Knocking on the window. I jumped back, stifling the scream that threatened to escape. The knocks were light, rhythmic, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. Lucas, please. It's okay. Just look. The voice was my mother's, or at least it sounded like her. I looked toward the door, confused. My mother was downstairs, I was sure of it, but the voice coming from the window was identical to hers. I swallowed hard and stepped further back, the words from the diary echoing in my mind. No matter what you hear, don't look. The knocking continued for a while, but I didn't move. Eventually it stopped and silence returned. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The bells kept ringing, and this time they seemed louder than ever. The sound of the bells was almost deafening now, as if the very air around me vibrated with their metallic chime. Each toll felt synchronized with my racing heartbeat, sweat dripping down my forehead as I stood frozen, staring at the closed curtain. Everything inside me screamed to obey the rule, to step back, but there was another force, something deeper, urging me forward. I had to know. I had to see. I took a deep breath and reached for the curtain. My arm trembled as if it carried the weight of something invisible but inescapable. When my fingers finally touched the fabric, the sound shifted. The bells slowed, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. The silence was even more terrifying than the noise. With a courage I didn't know I had, I pulled back a small portion of the curtain. At first, everything seemed normal. The snow blanketed the yard, and the faint moonlight cast long shadows on the trees. But then I saw them. They were there, 3 figures, tall and thin, stood motionless in the middle of the yard. At first glance, they appeared human, but something about them was profoundly wrong. Their arms were too long, hanging beside their bodies like the branches of dead trees. Their heads tilted slightly, as if they were listening to something I couldn't hear. The moonlight barely illuminated their faces, but I saw enough. Their eyes glowed faintly, like extinguished lanterns reflecting an unseen light. But the worst part was their mouths. They were smiling. It's not a human smile. It was far too wide, stretching to where the cheeks should have ended. The teeth, or what seemed like teeth, were thin and sharp, aligned irregularly. That smile wasn't an expression of joy, but something more primal. A warning. My entire body froze, the air trapped in my lungs. They didn't move, but something about the way they were positioned made me feel they knew I was there, that they were waiting for me. That's when I noticed another detail. There were marks on the ground around them, geometric shapes drawn in the snow, almost erased by the wind. Triangles, circles, and lines that made no sense, yet seemed to have a purpose. My gaze returned to the figures. Their smiles were wider now, as if they had sensed my presence. Then one of them began to move. It was slow, deliberate. One of its arms rose, the long fingers pointing directly at the window where I stood. My heart raced, and for a moment I couldn't move. Only when the figure took its first step toward me did I react. I slammed the curtain shut, stumbling backward and falling onto the floor. The bells rang again, now so loud they seemed to come from inside my head. I covered my ears with my hands, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. That's when I heard the voice. "Lucas, why did you look?" It was my mother's voice, but distorted, as if someone were imitating it. I looked toward the bedroom door, expecting to see her there, but it was empty. The voice came again, now quieter, like a whisper. "You shouldn't have looked." The doorknob began to turn slowly. My entire body froze, unable to decide whether to run or stay put. When the door finally opened, there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, lit faintly by the light coming from under my parents' bedroom door. But the sound of the bells continued, mixed with the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs. I knew it wasn't my parents. I shut my eyes, trying to remember the words from my grandmother's diary. "They cannot enter without being invited." But what did invited mean? I had already looked. Was that enough? The footsteps stopped in front of my door. Then something started knocking. It wasn't a normal knock. It was rhythmic, mimicking the sound of the bells. "Knock, knock, knock." The same voice as before, now louder, said, "Open the door, Lucas. We want to see you smile." I didn't move, terror holding me in place. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound stopped. But I knew it wasn't over. I had broken the rule, and they wouldn't leave without taking something from me. When the bells finally ceased, I realized I was still sitting on the floor, staring at the closed curtain. The silence that filled the house didn't bring relief, but an oppressive emptiness. I crawled back into bed, trying to steady my breathing. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind outside felt amplified, as if everything conspired to keep me alert. When the sun finally lit up the room, I still hadn't slept. But the dawn didn't ease the sense that something was wrong. If anything, it made it worse. The kitchen was full when I went downstairs, but the atmosphere was strange. No one spoke to me. My mother, always the first to ask how I'd slept, avoided even looking in my direction. My father kept himself busy, cutting toast into perfect squares that he didn't eat. My grandmother, sitting in her usual armchair, gave me a look that made me feel small, as if she knew exactly what I had done. I tried to break the silence. "Good morning." No one replied. I stood in the doorway, waiting for some kind of interaction, but my family continued acting as though I wasn't there. It was as if my place in the house had shifted, as though I was an intruder they didn't know how to expel. Finally, my grandmother broke the silence. "You looked." The room froze. My parents looked up, but no one spoke. The air felt heavier. I started, but I couldn't finish. There was no point denying it. She knew. My grandmother sighed, her shoulders sagging as if they had borne a weight for far too long. They know too. The rest of the day was torture. Even without anyone saying anything, I felt the judgment in every movement, every furtive glance. The tense atmosphere of the house had been replaced by something worse, a kind of grim acceptance. But it wasn't just my family's behavior that had changed. There was something in the very environment. A feeling that their eyes, the ones I had seen the night before, were still there somewhere. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift subtly. Once or twice, I could have sworn I saw something slipping behind me as I passed through a hallway. In the bathroom, while brushing my teeth, something made me stop. The mirror. First, it didn't seem off. But as I looked closer, I realized my reflection wasn't quite in sync with me. There was a subtle delay between my movements and what I saw. I blinked, and my reflection blinked a fraction of a second later. I bolted out of the bathroom, my heart racing, but I told no one. They already knew what I had done. That night, the cold in my room was unbearable. Even with the windows shut and extra blankets, it felt as if something icy radiated from the walls. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though something was there, standing beside the bed, watching. At one point, I felt a slight weight on the mattress, as if someone had sat down. I didn't have the courage to open my eyes. When the clock struck midnight, I waited to hear the bells again, but everything remained silent. That silence, however, was worse than the sound. It was as though something was waiting, preparing. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I found my mother in the living room, distractedly organizing a pile of papers. She looked even more tired than the day before. "Why are you all treating me like this?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. "What's going on?" She didn't answer immediately. She simply dropped the papers and looked at me with eyes full of sadness and something else. Something that looked like fear. "Because now they know where you are," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "And they'll want more." "More of what?" I asked, but she only shook her head and left the room. More of what? The question echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. My memories of the previous night were muddled, fragmented. But one thing was clear. I had opened the door to something I didn't understand, and now they wouldn't leave. The tension that had hung over the house since the previous morning seemed to have reached its breaking point. No one spoke to me directly, but their glances, heavy with worry and fear, were impossible to ignore. My body felt drained, as if simply existing in that house was sapping my energy. I couldn't live in the dark anymore. Not after what I had seen, after what I had felt. That night, after dinner, I gathered the courage to confront them. "I know you all know what happened," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "I looked, I broke the rule, and now I want the truth." My parents and grandmother were sitting in the living room, while my Uncle Davi stayed off to the side, near the fireplace, staring into the flames. None of them responded immediately. The silence was so thick it felt as if I had shouted. My mother was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have done that." "Why?" I demanded. "What happens to those who look?" My grandmother, who had been silent until then, raised her eyes to meet mine. There was something indescribable in her expression, a mixture of pity and guilt. "Because they stay." "What?" I asked, confused. She sighed and began to speak, each word weighted with profound sadness. "The bells are a warning. They pass only for those who don't look. For those who see, they stay." My mind raced back to the previous night, to the figures in the yard, their glowing eyes, their grotesque smiles. "Stay?" My voice was low, almost a whisper. "What does that mean?" My grandmother hesitated, but it was my mother who answered. It means they now know you've seen them. You're no longer invisible to them. I felt a knot form in my stomach. So that's it? They're going to follow me? My mother averted her eyes, as though trying to avoid the question. It was my Uncle Davi who broke the silence. It's not that simple. They don't just follow. They take. Take what? I asked, though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Davi shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. They take everything. Your life, your mind, your soul. Everything that makes you who you are. Davi's words echoed through the room, and for a moment, no one said anything. Then I looked at each of them, trying to grasp what now seemed obvious. My family knew far more than they were letting on. And you? I asked, looking directly at my mother. Have you looked? My mother paled, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and fear. She shook her head, but her hesitation was clear. Don't lie to me, I shouted. I know there's something you're not telling me. Finally, my grandmother spoke again, her voice weaker, as though the words pained her. It's not something we talk about. It's not something we can talk about. Why not? I pressed. Because remembering brings them back. My legs began to tremble, and I sat on the couch to avoid collapsing. My Uncle Davi, who had seemed like an observer until now, stepped forward. Do you think it's a coincidence that your mother always seems on edge this time of year? That I avoid talking about this? That your grandmother repeats the rules like a mantra? We all know what happens when you look. And all of us, at some point, he stopped, swallowing the words as though they were poison. All of you have looked, haven't you? I asked, my voice barely audible. My grandmother shook her head slowly. Not all of us, but enough to carry this burden. It felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath me. It wasn't just me. My entire family had been wrapped in this secret for years. Decades, maybe. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. We looked, and we learned to live with it. How? My question came out as a desperate cry. How do you go on living, knowing they're there? My mother didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the living room window and pulled back the curtains, checking outside. The movement was instinctive, like someone who lives in constant fear. There's no escaping them now, Lucas, she said. But you can still avoid making it worse. Don't talk about it. Don't call to them. And never invite them in. The room fell silent again. But now I felt something else. An incomplete truth, a greater secret they weren't willing to share. But I knew I wouldn't stop there. Because now, more than ever, I needed to understand what would happen next. After my family's revelations, the air in the house grew heavier, as though we were all waiting for something inevitable. Even during the day, the light seemed dimmer, the cold sharper, and the silence unbearable. But it was at night that things truly began to change. The bells, which had previously rung only from outside, now seemed to come from everywhere. The metallic chime echoed through the walls, muffled yet persistent, until I could no longer tell where it was coming from. Then the knocking began. At first, it was soft, almost as if a child were playing outside my bedroom window. But by the third night, it grew stronger, rhythmic, like large, heavy fists pounding the glass. I didn't need to look to know there was no one there. The voices returned, too, whispering my name in familiar tones, mimicking my mother's voice, sometimes my father's. It was always the same plea. Lucas, open the door. Come see. It's okay. The first time, I sat frozen on the bed, my heart racing and my body paralyzed. But the second time, something happened. I stood, without realizing it, and walked to the bedroom door, my fingers already brushing the doorknob when something made me stop. It was my grandmother's voice, echoing in my memory. Never invite them in. Sleep deprivation soon began to take its toll on me. I lost track of time, and every time I blinked, it felt like hours had passed. I'd find myself in different parts of the house without remembering how I got there. One night, While wandering aimlessly through the hallway, I heard voices coming from the living room. Following the whispers, I stopped at the foot of the stairs, listening to a conversation between my Uncle Davi and my grandmother. "We can't let this go on," Davi said, his voice heavy with frustration. "He has to endure it," my grandmother replied firmly. "It's the only way, and what if he can't?" Davi pressed. "You know what happened to Eduardo?" My heart stopped. Eduardo. That was the name of an older cousin no one ever talked about. I vaguely remembered old photos of him in the house, but never knew why they had disappeared. My grandmother sighed deeply before responding. "Eduardo broke the rule. He looked, and in the end, they took him. Then why don't we tell Lucas what's really happening? He deserves to know." "Because it won't help." My grandmother's voice rose, something rare for her. "Knowing doesn't change the fate of those who look." Their conversation continued, but I couldn't hear anything else. My heartbeat was so loud it drowned out the sounds. That night, I made an impulsive decision to run. I couldn't stay in the house, surrounded by my family's silence and the growing presence of the figures that now seemed to haunt every corner. I grabbed a coat and my backpack and waited until everything was quiet. I crept down the stairs, each step a risk, each creak of the wood a potential alarm. When I reached the back door, I hesitated for a moment. It was as if something inside me was screaming not to do it. But then I opened the door and stepped out. The cold night air hit me like a slap. Snow was falling softly, but something felt wrong. The world seemed empty, as if the house was the only place that existed. I started walking, my feet crunching in the snow, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. But with every step, I felt like I was being watched. The sound of the bells returned, faint at first, then louder, until it surrounded me. And then I saw them. They were everywhere. In the yard, in the shadows of the trees, at the edges of the path. The same tall, thin figures, motionless but unmistakably aware of my presence. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, and their grotesque smiles. Those awful smiles were wider now, as if they knew something I didn't. My legs trembled, but I kept walking, trying to ignore them. Yet with every step, they seemed closer. I looked back and saw that the house door was still open, but now it seemed as far away as the horizon. The figures began to move slowly, their joints bending in ways that defied human anatomy. One of them raised its arm, pointing directly at me, and I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. The sound of the bells became unbearable, as if they were inside my head. Suddenly, I couldn't move. I was trapped, surrounded by them, unable to look anywhere else. Then one of them spoke. Looking was only the beginning. When I finally made it back to the house, the cold night air cutting into my skin and the bells still echoing in my mind, I knew there was no escape. They were everywhere, and no matter where I ran or what I did, the figures wouldn't stop until they had taken me. I stepped through the back door, trembling, my fingers numb from the cold. The house was shrouded in an oppressive silence, as if it were waiting for the next move. My family didn't appear. Perhaps they were hiding, or perhaps they knew that this time I would have to face it alone. But something inside me, whatever was left of my courage or sheer desperation, told me I had to confront them. Not for myself, but for the house, for my family. I climbed up to the attic, the stairs creaking under my feet, and searched for my grandmother's diary. It was in its usual place, tucked in one of the boxes, surrounded by old, dusty belongings. I flipped through the pages quickly, my eyes scanning for something I could use. And there it was, symbols drawn in hurried handwriting, notes about the power of candles and salt, and a final warning. Don't try to destroy them. Just stop them from taking everything. My hands trembled as I grabbed a box of old candles, a piece of charcoal, and a handful of salt I found at the back of a shelf. I descended the stairs, feeling the silence grow heavier with each step. In the living room, I drew the symbols on the floor in an uneven circle, doing my best to replicate the drawings from the diary. Around the circle, I placed the candles, lighting them one by one with a box of matches that barely worked. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. They feed on fear but cannot stand being confronted. The bells started just before midnight. I was sitting in the center of the circle, the charcoal still staining my fingers, when I heard the metallic chime. It was different this time, louder, more rhythmic. The vibrations seemed to reverberate through the floor and walls, as if the entire house was responding to the sound. They were close. The figures began to appear outside, more numerous than before. Their thin, distorted shapes were visible through the curtains, and even without seeing their faces directly, I knew they were smiling. The front door trembled, as if something was pressing against it. Then came the knocking, loud, deliberate, like fists pounding the wood. "Lucas," came the whisper, cold and relentless. "You know you can't run." I shut my eyes and began murmuring the words from the diary, a prayer my grandmother had written that seemed to make no sense. But each syllable felt heavy, as if it carried something beyond my understanding. The knocking stopped, but the sound of the bells continued. Then the front door simply opened. They entered. The figures didn't need to cross the threshold like something physical. They simply appeared inside the room, one by one, their presence filling the space. Their eyes glowed like beacons in the darkness, and their wide, grotesque smiles seemed to consume their entire faces. The candles around me flickered, almost going out, but they stayed lit. One of the figures leaned toward me, its head moving irregularly, its bones cracking like dry branches. Its voice echoed directly in my mind, a sound so cold it felt like it was freezing the air itself. "You think you can push us back with drawings and words?" My hands trembled, but I kept reciting the prayer. One of the figures tried to cross the circle of candles but stopped abruptly, recoiling as if repelled by something invisible. "You can't touch me here," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. They didn't respond. Instead, they began to move around the circle, defying the laws of physics, their motions eerie and unnatural. Then something changed. One of the candles went out. "No!" I screamed, feeling panic swell within me. Without the complete circle, the safe space began to unravel. The figures moved closer, their smiles wider, their eyes locked onto mine. "You looked," they said in unison, their voices blending into a terrifying chorus. "And now you belong to us." The pressure in the air was suffocating. The floor beneath me felt as if it were collapsing, pulling me toward something unseen. In a final moment of courage, I threw salt onto the ground around me, scattering it across the remnants of the circle. The figures hesitated, their movements becoming erratic. "You can't take me," I shouted, the words more of a plea to myself than a declaration of certainty. One by one, the figures began to fade, dissolving into smoke and disappearing into the air. But before they were entirely gone, one lingered, tilting its head to the side. "You've won tonight," it said, its smile so wide it seemed to split its face in two. "But we always come back." And then silence returned. When dawn broke, I was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by the remains of candles and the smudged symbols on the ground. I knew I had managed to push them away for now, but the victory wasn't permanent. Because they were right, they always came back. I understood that my confrontation with them wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of something much darker. Since that night, the house seemed to change around me. The cold was sharper, and the whispers, once subtle, now echoed through the hallways even during the day. My family moved like shadows of themselves, avoiding my gaze, as though they had accepted a fate I was only beginning to grasp. But I truly understood everything that night when the bells returned. I was alone in the living room, sitting on the couch with my grandmother's diary still in my hands. The candles had burned out, and the symbols on the floor had faded into faint stains. The bells began slowly, their tone deeper and heavier, almost as if they were coming from within me. And then they appeared. The figures were no longer outside. They were inside the house, scattered across the corners of the room, their eyes glowing in the dim light. First, they said nothing. They just stood there, motionless, staring at me. But I could feel the weight of their gaze, as though they were dissecting every part of me. Finally, one of them spoke, its voice piercing into my mind like an icy blade. Choose. Choose what? My voice was weak, barely audible. Another figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes burning with unbearable intensity. You or them? My heart stopped. What? You looked. You brought us here. Now, either you come with us or we take the others. I glanced toward the stairs, where I knew my family was hiding. I could feel their fear, almost as if it were my own. This was happening because of me. I had known it from the start, but hearing it directly from these beings was like a blow to the chest. They didn't lie. They never lied. Why me? I asked, desperately trying to buy time. Because you saw us, and now you belong to us. The figures began to move, closing in around me, their impossible smiles stretching wider, as if savoring the moment. The sound of the bells grew louder, echoing off the walls until it became deafening. I thought of my mother, her look of fear mixed with a sadness that had always been there, as though she had known this day would come. I thought of my father, my uncle, my grandmother. They had all lived with the weight of this curse for so long, but they had never faced it as I was. The choice was obvious. Take. My voice faltered, and I had to take a deep breath to continue. Take me. The figures paused for a moment, as though relishing my decision. One of them stepped closer, so near that I could feel the icy chill radiating from its presence. You've chosen well. The room darkened, as though all the light had been drained from it. The floor beneath me vanished, and the sound of the bells became overwhelming, reverberating inside my skull. I glanced toward the stairs one last time, hoping to see my mother, but the darkness swallowed me before I could say anything. And then, everything disappeared. The house is quiet now, silent in a way it never was before. The Christmas lights still blink in the living room, casting soft shadows on the walls. Snow falls slowly outside, blanketing everything in a serene white veil. My family has returned to their routine, but there's something different about them. It's as if an invisible weight has been lifted, as though they can finally breathe again. The bells have stopped. Everything seems normal, but I know it's not. I look into the hallway mirror and see something that shouldn't be there. My eyes, they glow now with the same intensity one saw in the figures. And the smile, that impossible smile, one that should never exist on a human face, now belongs to me. I don't know what I am now. I don't know if I'm still myself or if I've become part of them. But I know I'm here, and maybe, just maybe, they are too. Christmas continues, quieter than ever before, but something has changed forever. Because once you've looked, you can never be the same again.